Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this really exciting webinar that we're all looking forward to. I'm Simon Newman, the CEO of the Online Dating and Discovery Association, the recognised trade body for the sector. A couple of quick housekeeping rules before we start today's webinar. We are recording the session today. It will be shared with everyone who's registered to attend today's event, including those who are joining us live. If you do have any questions, I know our guests today will be delighted to answer those. Please drop them into the chat or the Q&A function. We will be able to come to those at the end of the presentation, and I will make sure that we get to those as well today. So please do use this as an opportunity to ask some questions. So for anyone joining us for the first time, a quick reminder, the ODDA is the global authority for online dating and the social discovery sector. We work very closely with our members around the world to shape policy, define standards, and importantly, champion safe, authentic human connection in the digital age. And that's really about giving platforms the intelligence and tools they need to stay ahead of a rapidly evolving landscape. And of course, that landscape is evolving fast, as we've just described. The data we'll be covering today makes that very, very clear indeed. Deepfakes, the subject of our webinar, have risen hugely, over 300% year on year globally, and the dating sector, of course, is working very hard to combat this threat. And that is exactly why we're here this morning. Today's session is focused on what that data actually means for platforms, how deepfakes work, how they're getting through existing verification infrastructure, and what good detection looks like in 2026. And I'm delighted to be joined by two fantastic colleagues today from Sumsub, who between them cover both the technical and importantly, the regulatory dimensions of this challenge around deepfakes. So Kat, Arena, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks, Simon. So as you very graciously provided the introduction, today we are going to be doing a deep dive into deepfakes. So I'm, like you said, Simon, I am here with my colleague Arena. So what we're going to do over the next couple of minutes is give a bit of a background, first a little bit into Sumsub, and then go into the key topic at hand, deepfakes. So for those who may not know, and those who did not join our webinar a couple of weeks ago, Sumsub is a global identity verification and fraud prevention solution. So we sit in the middle of that onboarding journey where we have put everything into one platform to try and make it as seamless and as robust as possible when someone is going through the onboarding journey. And I think key for, especially for this sector, is that it's not just financial services that consumers are going through an onboarding journey. It's becoming more and more part of everything that they need to do as they integrate more and more online. So when you're logging into a dating website or you're logging into another application with the goal to meet someone, you're probably going to go through an onboarding journey. So what we really do is provide that robust fraud kind of preventing solution at the beginning to make sure that consumers are protected. But like I said, and Simon, you already touched on it. So every year, we actually publish identity fraud report where we look at all the different trends. We collect information across the globe on where are we seeing deepfakes. It doesn't just cover deepfakes. It goes into other things like identity theft. It goes into what documents are actually most vulnerable. But what we saw last year was that deepfakes increased 300% year on year. And based on our data, that actually equated to 7% of all of the global fraud. So 7% of fraud that is happening across the globe is directly correlated to deepfakes. And again, this is not just within financial services. This is across sectors. This is really just looking at identity and the fraud that's happening within the identity space. So 7%, that's pretty crazy. So what are we really also seeing within that? So obviously we see these really astronomical numbers related to deepfakes, but I think it's interesting that the other trend we noticed was it's almost kind of where we're progressing with the world as the world is progressing. So previously, what was traditionally used was just stolen information that people purchased on the dark web, they purchased online in order to conduct things like deepfakes or to conduct identity fraud more generally. What we're seeing now actually is, in my opinion, slightly more terrifying. It's actually more looking into and utilizing things like AI. So entering that space of synthetic identities. And I think that's really where we're seeing deepfakes be used more and more. And we're also seeing it become slightly easier with the introduction of AI to do deepfakes. Because I think we've all probably seen them multiple times on social media, in the news, where someone has taken a celebrity's face and just superimposed it on themselves. It's become more and more easy to do that with the introduction of AI. So that's kind of the next trend that we're seeing is this shift to more sophisticated fraud being used by fraudsters in order to kind of go around these onboarding processes or go around these KYC processes. So again, kind of looking at there's still the individual fraud. So this is the things that us as consumers will impact us more. So it's where your documents are being forged or where we are seeing documents that have been forged or purchased online and then details have been changed. We're still seeing a huge increase or just a huge prevalence of identity theft. I think that will always unfortunately continue to be there. And we're seeing more and more people are falling victim to that. Things like synthetic fraud is kind of the biggest growth trend that we're seeing. But what we're seeing more of is this actual fraud at scale. So with the sophistication of AI, we're also seeing a sophistication of these fraudsters. So less and less, it tends to be an individual acting in their room by themselves. What we're seeing is actually more organized fraud rings or organized fraud networks where these individual fraudsters are coming together and are kind of attacking as an organized unit and they're going after these things. And that's where we're seeing so those organized fraud rings as well as these bot farms. So again, going into kind of AI where more and more people are utilizing that and they're just continuously attacking the same type of KYC onboarding processes. They'll use the same type of information, but slightly change it here and there. So they're making minute changes that the AI is then learning, and then that AI continues to try and do those attacks going forward. I think the traditional ones like money mules, we're continuing to see those. They're not probably going to go away, unfortunately. A lot of people don't necessarily have the education available to them to fully understand exactly what a money mule is. But I just wanted to quickly kind of cover the identity fraud landscape before we go into the deep dive around deepfakes. So just so everyone is on the same page, internally, how we define a deepfake is it's any media, so it could be an image, it could be a video, it could even be audio, that has been digitally altered and generated using AI or just LLMs in general. Where it becomes a deepfake actually is if the goal of using that media is to conduct fraudulent activities. So if it's to impersonate an individual so that it looks like they have agreed or consented to a transaction that they didn't actually agree to or consent to. So, because what we see a lot of times is people will use deepfakes for jokes, for funny things, but where it turns into deepfakes in regards of fraud is really if the goal of that deepfake is to cause harm to another consumer or to make it look like that consumer who's actually the person being deepfaked has consented or agreed to do something that they actually didn't do. So pulling on the same report that we published last year, so specifically in the UK, we saw that deepfakes rose by 94% year on year. So like we saw obviously last for global, it was 300%. Specifically for the UK, it was 94%. And then overall in the UK, the fraud rate, so that's including every element of fraud, rose by 2%. Compared to some other countries, that's not that bad. Other countries did see higher increases, but it is still worth noting that deepfakes and fraud in general are getting and are continuing to grow within the UK as well as globally. The thing that I also found really interesting was that, so as part of our identity research, we look at all of our data, but we also do speak to consumers. And what we did is we asked them questions about, like, do you know deepfakes? Do you know what money mules are? And the data we found on that was that 58% of the people we spoke to have encountered a deepfake. So just kind of be it online, be it in their personal life, but they have actually encountered it. So it's no longer kind of this concept that is only affecting a few people. It's becoming more and more prevalent in the fact that we're seeing majority of consumers are just kind of being faced with this type of media. So only 8% actually were targeted or were deceived by that, which I think is definitely a good number that we should be proud of, especially for the UK. But still, there's 23% who still haven't seen it. So there's still a scope that, yes, there's 58% who have encountered it, with 8% actually being directly deceived, but there's 23% who still haven't. So there's still scope for us to do education. It's still important that we need to make sure everyone understands what a deepfake is. They understand how to spot them, how to kind of counteract them as they continue to grow. So with that, I wanted to go into how they are made. So this is again kind of pulling from our expertise that we see are the most common methods that fraudsters are using to actually build out these deepfakes. So a lot of them are using generative adversarial networks. So this is where you're taking two algorithms and you're just kind of having them fight against each other to figure out what creates the best fake faces. What are the faces that we can actually kind of figure out and make build them like robust enough that they'll actually pass or they'll get through any of those KYC checks that you have to encounter when onboarding. And then the other AI is then just kind of attacking those. It's essentially trying to find all of the gaps that say, you know, like the eyes look a little bit different or that mouth doesn't really match up. So essentially you're creating this ultimate AI that is learning from both of those. So it's taking those two insights and saying, okay, how can I create the strongest face or the strongest audio or the strongest image so that it can bypass all of these checks? The other one that we're all probably actually we tend to see more often, that's slightly easier to spot to the naked human eye, is those face swappings or the reenactments. So these are the things that you've probably seen on social media where a celebrity has endorsed a game that you were playing on your phone. This is what is most likely happening in those instances. So it's where a fraudster will take either a real video of a celebrity or a real image of a celebrity or even just their target and put it over their actual face or someone else's face. So in this instance, so it would be if someone wanted to deepfake Simon, they would put Simon's face on top of mine. And then it would have him like they would map his mouth to the way that I'm speaking, his hands to the way that I'm moving my hands. That's that kind of face swapping and reenactment side. So like I said, those are the most two common ways that we are seeing fraudsters kind of build out these deepfakes and introduce them into kind of the workflows when they're doing the KYC checks. How do we stop them? And I think with this, I want to preference it that we're always continuously trying to understand ways to mitigate them. Because the one negative of fraudsters is that they're always trying to figure out ways to get around us. So it's this ongoing battle between fraudsters as well as companies like Sumsub, where we're always trying to build out the best technology, the best mitigation tools to detect these and to stop them. So the first step is we always try and push for kind of what we call a liveness check. Some of you have probably come across this. It's where like you're using your phone and your phone tells you to move your face around in a circle or side to side, things like that. That is just kind of essentially mapping your face and mapping how you would move, things like that, just to get a sense of what are your natural movements as an individual. So we then understand that. And then what we do is that's kind of where you would then see if someone has tried to hack the device. So let's say someone's hacked your iPhone, and while you're trying to do those checks, we're in the background running to make sure that that device has not been injected with any malware or has not been attacked. So that way we can stop it kind of at the device level as well as at the image level. We then go and internally kind of do the checks based on the way your face has moved, based on the images you've provided. We'll spot kind of those more common things. So if it's been a screenshot that's been reused, if there's a face mask that's on top of it that they're trying to get around, so that those tend to like map weirdly onto an individual's face. We're looking at all of that information, again, using any images that you've provided, as well as kind of the liveness test that you've just completed to get a sense of it does this face match up? Do the eyes match up? Does the mouth match up? All of those elements. And then finally, what we'll do is we'll always kind of just cross-check that against what are the common flags that we see with deepfakes. So again, looking at the mouth, looking at the eyes. The other thing that we also look at is the background. Because a lot of times people will superimpose over the face, they can get it almost perfect. But where we start to see a lot of the information, a lot of the data is in the background. So for my background, because we can all see it, obviously it's blurred, but you can still take things out. So you can see that there's a dark curtain to my side. If let's say Simon tried to deepfake one of my photos, we would flag that, oh, there's also a dark curtain in his side of the photo. We would see that, oh, like there's light on her shoulder. There's also light on his shoulder. So you start to map those similarities and you understand that most often people are not going to have the exact same backgrounds. There's not going to be the same stroke of light. There's not going to be the same dark thing in the back corner. You map that information as well as mapping the individual's facial features or the way that they move to get a better sense of has this image been reused or is this actually the first time we're seeing this image and this is a legitimate person. So I want to take time to just go specifically more into deepfakes and online dating because unfortunately, I think the online dating and discovery world is quite susceptible to deepfakes. And a lot of times it's where we do see quite a lot of deepfakes coming up. So again, kind of pulling on our data from our identity fraud report, unfortunately, we found that dating is and online media are some of the strongest when it comes to kind of the fraud rates within those sectors. I will say, I think we can definitely congratulate ourselves that if you look at the image, dating last year in 2024 was over 8%. It has now dropped to just a little bit over 6%. So I think that's a huge step in the right direction. And it does show that dating platforms are kind of taking the necessary steps that they need to try and counteract the use of deepfakes within this sector. But I think the reason why it's so susceptible is because there is no mandated KYC checks. So anything that these platforms have done, it's kind of their own goodwill. So what we really, it may not be right to push for a specific piece of regulation, but what we are seeing, and I think that's helped to take that number from a little over 8% to a little over 6%, is we're starting to see some of these platforms introduce KYC checks where you might see that this individual has been verified or they're verifying the images to try and detect things like deepfakes. So I think it's definitely a step in the right direction, but that is one of the strongest reasons why the sector is most susceptible to deepfakes. I think it's also, and this slightly goes into kind of the romance fraud that we tend to see come from some things like dating platforms, is that individuals who are on these platforms, they're emotionally more likely to be manipulated because they're looking for someone. So in a dating perspective, they're probably looking for someone that they'll date and hopefully fall in love with. From a just kind of more discovery platform, probably just looking for friendships. But there's that emotional connection that this individual is trying to kind of get an emotional connection or something out of it from an emotional perspective. And anytime emotions are included, it tends to cloud individuals' judgments. So we always, and like the fraudsters know that. So they are leaning into that emotional manipulation in order to try and deceive individuals who are on these platforms. I think the other issue is that a lot of fraudsters will use real videos that they have actually included and built deepfakes into these videos to surpass those KYC checks. And I think that goes back to the first point that any KYC checks that have been introduced, they're not to the robust level that we would see in financial services. I'm not saying they need to be, and I'm not kind of saying it's bad that the dating platforms haven't pushed that, but it's because there is no requirement. So the fraudsters know this. So they know that they don't necessarily have to have everything perfect when they're trying to do the onboarding journey. They just need to get past the kind of lighter touch KYC checks that we do see some platforms introducing. And then finally, it's a lot of the apps. So the criminals they'll actually inject into the camera of the device. So that was the point that I was making in the previous slide on step two, that we always do that kind of device check to make sure that the device has not been tampered with or has not been injected with malware. A lot of the platforms don't necessarily do that check. And again, there's no legal requirement for them. So I completely understand why they're not doing that check, but it is just kind of another point in that journey that does allow the fraudsters to get in and to introduce profiles that are kind of specifically built for the purpose of deep faking individuals and causing emotional or consumer harm. And with that, I wanted to hand over to my colleague Arena, who will give us kind of an overview of all of the regulatory and compliance drivers for deepfakes.
Thank you so much, Kat. Well, yeah, I haven't discussed why deepfakes present a particularly significant risk in dating industry. Let's now look at the regulatory and compliance considerations. They're currently still driving platforms to address these risks more proactively. While there is indeed no single legal framework dedicated specifically to deepfakes, especially in online dating, there are still several existing regulatory regimes that are becoming relevant. And first of them is for sure data privacy, because many of the tools, and basically all of the tools which are dedicated to detect deepfakes or even verify the identities, they actually involve the processing of personal data and sometimes biometric data. So during the verification, for sure, the personal data is processed. And of course, while these measures for sure can help to reduce fraud, sometimes they raise important GDPR or other data privacy related considerations around transparency, proportionality, security, and lawful processing. Moreover, once the company is deciding to verify the users, they still can handle that data privacy obligations very, very, let's say so, cautious. The second aspect here is for sure still identity assurance, because deepfakes and of course synthetic identities, they kind of challenge traditional methods of establishing trust online. And we have already again seen the numerous romance scams cases where fraudsters use AI-generated profile photos or, for instance, fabricated identities to build relationships with other users over long periods of time before actually I don't know, requesting money or promoting like fraudulent opportunities or other activities. And again, while dating platforms are generally not subject to financial sector or industry-specific QIC obligations, there is increasing pressure to demonstrate that reasonable measures are in place to again reduce this kind of risk, especially impersonation or fake accounts and also romance scams, for instance. I also wanted to mention actually the age verification aspect because it's becoming a very, very relevant topic during the past years. And protecting minors online has become a major regulatory priority across multiple jurisdictions, specifically in the UK, in the European Union, and basically some of the countries in the Middle East are also very like they pay a lot of attention to the to age assurance mechanisms. And yeah, we're actually about to see growing expectations around effective measures, particularly where users may become exposed to harmful content or some other risks. And of course, deepfake technology adds another layer of complexity because, for instance, modern AI tools can alter a person's appearance, potentially making them appear significantly younger or older, and undermining, let's say so, traditional age verification methods. And I've actually mentioned AI regulation, and we for sure see the rapid growth of generative AI, and it actually attracted significant regulatory attention. In the European Union, the AI Act introduces specific requirements, especially transparency requirements for certain AI-generated and manipulated content. More broadly here, like regulators are becoming increasingly concerned about synthetic identities and deceptive content and AI-enabled impersonation. Although much of the public discussion focuses on political deepfakes or celebrity impersonation at the same time, the same technology again is used from time to time within dating platforms to create highly convincing fake profiles, images, or interactions that are very difficult for users to identify as artificial. And it's not only about dating, it's basically becoming a problem in the general digital world. So the solution here is again can be, even though there are again no specific, no industry-specific regulations, is kind of safety by design, because in across a number of recent regulatory initiatives, we see a common expectations that platforms identify foreseeable risks, implement like proportionate risk adherent mitigation measures. And a good example here is actually the emergence of also real-time like face swapping technology, because historically users often relied on video calls also as evidence that the person behind profile was genuine. And as it was already mentioned, sometimes fraudsters can use this kind of tools during the video interactions. And this actually requires platforms to reconsider which controls remain effective, how risks should be assessed and mitigated. And taken together, like these developments demonstrate that still the deepfake mitigation is no longer simply like a fraud prevention exercise. They increasingly, like deepfakes, increasingly see it as at the intersection of privacy, online safety, AI governance, consumer protection. And still, since sometimes it can be challenging from a compliance perspective, um, from time to time, and basically most of the time, robust identity verification frameworks can become very important because while no control can eliminate deepfake-related risks entirely, modern solutions and especially modern QICs and identity assurance solutions can for sure significantly strengthen the platform reliance, especially by combining different checks that are currently available for the market. And from a compliance perspective, in this case, the objective will be not to like guarantee that some fraudulent activity or scam never occur within a platform, but still it will be helpful to demonstrate that the platform has implemented, again, this proportionate, risk-based, and effective measures to identify, prevent, and mitigate at least some foreseeable harms.
Thanks, Irina. So I think that is actually everything that we prepared from a slide presentation perspective. So we'll definitely open it up to questions. I think the final point I just want to make is deepfakes are annoyingly continuously growing and being used more and more commonly across different sectors, including the dating sector. And it's really important that as industry, we come together to figure out what is the right balance. As Irina just said, that we need to balance proportionality with the risk that we're seeing happen within this sector. So my kind of push to everyone who's listening is deepfakes are going to continue to happen. So we as industry need to come together to figure out what is the most proportionate way for us to try and stop these. So we are protecting the consumers that are trying to actually use these platforms for the purposes that they are truly intended for. So with that, I will just say a huge thank you to everyone, and I'll open it up to questions.
Thanks. Thank you, Kat and Irina. Fascinating. I mean, loads of really interesting things in there. Some of the statistics really shocking, and we'll come through. I'll come to some of those in a moment. I'm going to go straight to questions that we've had from our audience, and there's a couple of really great ones that have come in over the last sort of 20 minutes or so since you've been talking. But while you were talking, I was just reminding me. This morning in the UK, if you're watching the breakfast news, Jessa Sato, one of our members of parliament, was talking about deepfakes and her image being used inappropriately and having brought now a case against Elon Musk's X for being able to manipulate images in a way that are completely inappropriate. So, as you said, it's happening to lots of different people, but I thought that was quite relevant given where we are today. So, okay, let's go to our first question, and I think this is a great one which touched on something you mentioned earlier, Kat. So, the question asks: I've heard that face mapping used by some sites for liveness checks has already been broken by scam teams using AI. Are liveness checks likely to stand up long term as scammers work to beat them? That's a great question.
So I think definitely it's one of the tools that I think, and then we've been saying it throughout the presentation, that scammers are annoyingly always going to try and attack every single vector that they can, one of them being face mapping and liveness checks. What I would say from a long-term perspective, it's one of the arsenals in our tool belt. So it's one of the ways that we can try and identify and map the way that people are moving, the way that people are interacting. So I think more and more of these deepfakes are actually going into videos. And playing on the example that you literally just said, Simon, that for a lot of, especially political figures, it's a video that's being used. So it's definitely one of the tools that I think longer term will continue to be used. I don't think it will be the only tool that will be used. I think what we will see is a continued growth and a continued kind of evolution, kind of on the lines of innovation and learning from fraudsters, what are the other mitigation technologies that we could use? So like one thing that Sumsub actually does is in partnership with Interpol, we look at how are fraudsters using deepfake? How are they, what are their methods for integrating it into the KYC flow? So we're doing it from a law enforcement perspective because a lot of times, so for romance fraud, for example, they will go to law enforcement and say, I need help. So we're actually partnering with some of these institutions to try and figure out what are the fraudsters doing? How can we learn from these bad actors to make sure that we're building the right technology? So to answer your question, I think long-term liveness it'll just be one of the methods. And it will almost come down to the individual company that is doing these checks, be it Sumsub, be it our client, to figure out what is the actual best path for them. So at the moment, what we actually see a lot of our clients have multiple touch points. So they'll do a name check, they'll do an address verification, they'll do an email verification. So it's not just, oh, let me just check your name. It's actually 3 or 4 layers of verifications in order to make sure that they actually have a robust amount of information to feel comfortable that this customer is actually who they say they are rather than a fraudster. So if anything, it'll be one of the tools, but it won't be the only tool used.
Brilliant. And I guess the goal there is to try and do those multiple checks in a seamless way as possible to kind of reduce that friction, but also to frustrate the scammer so that they, give up effectively. I mean, I think, we've all recognized that fraudsters are incredibly sophisticated and it's impossible to stop all of them. But the idea is that we can hopefully make, certainly in the dating and discovery sector, less attractive to criminals than perhaps other sectors for them. So that's kind of our goal of where we're going. Brilliant. Our second question, which again is a really great question. What would you say is the current single most effective identity check that a dating or discovery site could use to prevent scammers stroke deepfakes?
For me, I would definitely say it's running those kind of like images through a deepfake detection tool. Obviously, we'd love it if you use Sumsub, but I think that is probably the best way because a lot of these consumers are going to either upload, so if it's a legitimate user, they're going to upload them from their individual camera roll, and it's quite easy to detect and see if anything has been manipulated. On the other end of the spectrum, where it's a fraudster, if you run it through a deepfake detection tool, which is kind of mapping all of those data points, understanding what this consumer actually would look like in a normal use case, then that's fine. And I think what especially unique challenge for the dating website is I think everyone nowadays is using AI. And like Simon, you and I have talked about this in the past. Everyone is using AI to make themselves look a little bit nicer when they're uploading these photos to dating websites. So what also allows, if you're using a deepfake detection tool, is that it will kind of map all that data points. So it will say like, oh, it looks like Kat has used some AI to maybe make herself look a little bit prettier, maybe remove some blemishes that she may have on her face. We would flag that in our tool, but it wouldn't be flagged in a way that's like, okay, this is fake, or this doesn't seem like it would match for the way that we think Kat would actually look based on all of the images we have. So it allows you as a dating platform to really understand the risk and set that risk tolerance to what you feel comfortable with. So kind of hitting on the point that Arena made around risk proportionality. So if you're using a deepfake detection tool, you can kind of set it to your individual risk tolerance. And it allows customers to still use AI. So it doesn't create that barrier where consumers are now immediately flagged as, oh, this is potentially deepfake when they just put it on an AI tool to remove blemishes. It really kind of creates and maps it to understand users and how everyone nowadays is actually using AI, but we're still able to identify the fraudsters and stop the fraudulent accounts.
Fantastic. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, we were saying this, weren't we, the other day about the fact that we all use AI. There are apps on the Google and Apple Play stores which allow you to, as you say, remove blemishes, or in my case, maybe add a bit of hair. Who knows? And I guess even many dating apps actually offer this facility to help people kind of make themselves look, in the best possible way that they can. So yes, it's an interesting balance, isn't it? And I think one of the takeaways from what you just said there is about the dating sites and discovery sites need to take a look themselves at where that tolerance of risk sits and where that line falls. So I think, yeah, really, really great response. And thank you for a great question. Again, reminder, we've got some time left, so please do put your questions in the Q&A, and I'm sure Arena and Kat will be delighted to answer those. Kat, I was going to come to one more question with you, and then I'll perhaps touch on a few things with Arena. But your role, broadly speaking, you're dealing with government relations. We obviously, as an association, speak regularly with policymakers and regulators. Do you think that the government, and I'm not saying just the UK, but internationally, across Europe, the US, and further afield, do you think they really understand the threats that deepfake presents to consumers on various online platforms?
I'd say yes and no. So I think what we've seen actually a lot of times is it's more on the age assurance conversation, but it does lean into kind of also the deep fakes. Is we've seen some countries have actually just point blank banned social media for
Mm,
individual consumers under certain ages. And one of the arguments for that is that at that age, it's a lot harder for those individuals to identify potential deep fakes. So they're more at risk of harm or falling victim to a deep fake fraud. So I think I'm not going to say that's the right approach. I don't think that we necessarily need to ban access to social media, but it does show that governments are aware of the potential implications. I think where we need to do more work, and that's where I think things like the Online Dating Discovery Association are kind of owning that, is education around what are the actual implications of deepfakes. And it's very difficult because, like you said, Simon, fraudsters are always moving faster than us, unfortunately. But it's really our job as industry to educate governments and to say, okay, this is what a deepfake looks like. This is how we can spot them. This is the tools that we need to use in order to make sure that platforms where consumers are interacting with potential deepfakes and might fall victim to potential deepfakes, these are the tools or these are the mechanisms that they should use to try and identify those before they become a legitimate profile or a legitimate harm to the consumer. So it's definitely an education piece. I think governments have a lot more to learn, but that responsibility falls on us, and it's really our
yeah.
job. I will say, I think the UK, earlier this year, they actually hosted a deepfake detection I think it was like a workshop is I think the
Yes.
right word. And it was hosted by the Home Office. Interpol was there. There were a bunch of
Brilliant.
like private companies who over 2 days essentially demonstrated to government leaders how to build the deep fake and then how to detect and stop that deep fake. So I think doing activities like that, doing workshops like that, it's a huge step in the right direction because it does hit on that education piece. Because unfortunately, deep fakes, building them and mitigating them is quite a technical thing.
Mm.
So it's really good to show people in real time how it is that these things are built and then how it is that companies can actually detect them and stop them. So I'd say there's definitely more work to do, but we are seeing governments make kind of steps in the right direction to try and understand what the risk is, but also to try and understand the technology behind these. So I'd say steps in the right direction, but still more work
Yeah,
for us to do.
more work done. Yeah, and I think it's staggering, isn't it? If you go back 2 or 3 years, we would be able to say to people, "Oh, this is how you spot a deep fake." Relatively straightforward. Things don't look quite right, the eyes aren't right, or the movements of
Mhm.
the mouth. But as technology evolves, of course, the use of AI and other technologies means that it's virtually impossible for a human to be able to spot a deep fake from the real thing. And I think we've
Exactly.
all seen them on the internet. They're incredibly convincing, aren't they? So, yeah, a real challenge where technology is the right approach, the right solution to tackle this emerging threat. Brilliant. Thank you for that, Kat. There's a couple more questions I'll come to in a second, but Arena, I just wanted to ask about compliance. And building on the point that Kat was mentioning there about the way that legislation is heading, um, do we, what does good look like in terms of compliance now, and thinking of what might come in the next year or two? And the reason I ask that is, if we look again at the UK with the Online Safety Act, that big overarching piece of legislation, there are smaller regulations that are regularly being drafted by Ofcom, including codes of practice and other measures that look to address specific threats. So, just interested in your sort of views on what good compliance looks like, and sort of any information or help you can share with our members to hopefully kind of get on top of this growing threat.
Thank you for the question. That's actually a great one. I think that if we look at the broader regulatory landscape, the governments, let's say, so are trying to address still two parallel challenges, and the first is fraud and online crime, something like that. So, in fact, not only in the UK, but in general across the jurisdictions, we see like increasing efforts to combat like identity fraud, scams, also money laundering for sure. or other forms of online abuse that may happen. And governments are encouraging like stronger identity assurance and better age verification, more effective reporting mechanisms, which is like the great focus for the past years, greater accountability. And here again, the deepfakes have become part of this discussion because again, they can make fraud or impersonation significantly more convincing and scalable.
Mm.
And at the same time, the approach to AI, for instance, which is currently used for deepfakes, it goes far beyond like fraud prevention in general, because when it comes to AI, there is also a challenge how to manage the broader, let's say so, societal impact of AI. And regulators are kind of increasingly focused on transparency, also privacy, fairness, accountability, and human oversight here as well. And the questions are also being asked about how AI influences decision making, for instance, how again the personal data used to train and operate AI systems, how users can distinguish like authentic content from synthetic content, let's say so, and also how organizations themselves, the companies, the businesses can ensure that AI systems are deployed responsibly, no matter for what they use. Because when we were talking about AI, like a step back about how the AI impacts deepfakes in general. In fact, AI is used from the both sides. So those technologies that are used for deepfake detection, they can also be trained and maintained with AI involvement. Um, so, like from a compliance perspective, the question is no longer, again, how to stop fraud. It's also increasingly about how to govern AI responsibly throughout the overall cycle. And I think again, the focus of the governments, they're not only to cope with something, but is to better understand the scenarios where, for instance, the fraud may occur, and again, how to cope with it proactively, not retrospectively, let's say so.
Mm. Fantastic, thank you, Ian. And while you were talking there, in fact, we had a question come in, which I kind of think it's a really important one to pick up on. And this is a bit me playing devil's advocate here about regulation, because we look at the digital omnibus that's recently been, I say approved. I know it's still got to go through some processes in Europe, which kind of gives the impression that legislation around AI is being watered down slightly. The UK has deliberately not so far gone down the path of a dedicated AI act as such. So the question is, and the question that's come in, do we see the future being one where we can see governments regulating AI companies to stop their technology being used to create deepfakes? Or do we think the onus is more going to be on the platforms to prevent it? That's probably quite a difficult question to answer, isn't it? But I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that.
I can quickly come in. I think Arena will have a lot more interesting thoughts on this. So I think what we're seeing, I'd say from a global perspective, so a couple of months ago, you could put into a certain online AI chatbot to create a British passport, and it would spit out a British passport.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was quite shocking. So I think what we've already seen is, and that stopped because it was flagged to actually to the UK government. And then they reached out to that AI chatbot and said, you need to do something so this cannot happen anymore. So I think it's definitely like we're seeing these AI companies, like once they're presented with like you need to
Mm.
stop this because it's doing this, they do make the changes. So you can no longer do that on that chatbot. So I think it's going to be, I'd say, similar to all kind of fintech regulation, that there's going to be a lot of onus on these AI companies. Where the challenge sits is that they're obviously not directly regulated by any of these governments. So exactly how much enforcement and how much pressure the governments can put on these companies is still to be seen. What we will see, I think, is more. good actors. So for the example I just touched on, they got the feedback from the government and they made the relevant changes so you couldn't do that anymore. So you're going to start to see more of these good actors who see that they want their platforms to be used to make knowledge more accessible, to streamline me typing up a million emails a day, things like that. And then we're going to see some that may lag and may kind of push back, similar to what we've seen in kind of social media in general. Because there's the age-old question, are they the responsible entities to remove hate speech or to remove these deepfake images? But there's no leverage that governments can push on them. So I think it's going to continue to be almost this chicken and egg scenario of
Yeah.
these AI companies need to be good actors and they need to make changes, but it's also on companies that we have to continuously catch up and continuously fight and build the best detection tools possible, knowing that we can go to government and government can speak to these companies, but also in some cases we can go directly to these companies and say, I've just made these 5 passports on your website. What can you do to stop that from happening? So I think it's like it's a circle, and we all need to
Yeah.
work together and have communication together to try and mitigate these tools as much as possible. But I do think some of the onus should be on these AI companies to make sure that the platforms they are putting out there aren't being used for these types of tools.
Because before it comes to Irene, because it just seems unfair on platforms that
It
the
does.
AI companies effectively creating this massive problem, and yet it's the platforms that are ultimately being held accountable for fixing those
Mhm.
problems or suffering the consequences of having deepfakes on their site. So I think it's a great question to ask, isn't it, about that point where the regulation needle, if you like, should be swung towards, and it seems to be that the AI companies are the ones that we should be looking at rather than the platforms. Sorry, Irina, I was cutting across you there. I'd really welcome your thoughts on this quite a fascinating, controversial question.
Well, in my opinion, actually, the future of AI regulation is unlikely to be about controlling the technology itself, because I would say that the regulatory frameworks are never about, again, controlling the technology.
Mm,
And it's always more likely to be about ensuring that every participant in the ecosystem can demonstrate like reasonable and proportionate like risk management. From one perspective, I would say, um, yeah, one area is likely to become increasingly important in content provenance, rather than relying entirely on platforms to detect deepfakes. Policymakers are kind of exploring ways to make AI-generated content identifiable from the outset through technical markers, metadata, or kind of watermarking mechanisms. And while the solutions are not perfect and they're not even close to become one, they still reflect a broader trend towards embedding trust, again, traceability. And for instance, for dating platforms, this also matters because responsibility may gradually be still distributed across the ecosystem, because from one perspective, AI providers may be expected to build safer tools and introduce transparency measures, while the platforms, and it's actually not only about dating, will continue to be expected to identify kind of misuse, protect the users, manage risks within their own services. But again, I don't really think we're moving toward a model where AI companies bear all responsibilities. We're moving toward a model where AI developers, AI platforms, and users each have a role, let's say so, to play in reducing the general harm that may be posed.
mm. Brilliant. Thank you, Irina. Really helpful thoughts there on kind of the regulatory approach. Kat, I think we've got a question for you, which I would really welcome your thoughts on. So, question is that you mentioned there is an issue where verification badges are attractive for scammers as they provide instant credibility. Would you say the risks of verification badges might outweigh the benefits? Another great question.
I would say no. I think so. Yes, 100% they're very, very attractive they're attractive to everyone. And I think what I'd almost say is keep those verification badges because it does provide like a quick source of truth. I think if we all like I still whenever I use Twitter, if I see that it has a little blue tick, I'm more likely to trust it rather than something that doesn't necessarily have a blue tick. I know obviously with Twitter they've changed it and you can now
Mm,
pay to get one of those, but it does provide a little bit more of a verification element to it and just a little bit more of a trustworthy element. I would still say it's up to the ultimate consumer to fully trust it, but I think in the online dating space, what I would say is keep the verification badges. They massively outweigh, and they actually provide a lot more trust and a lot more credibility to those users. And I think it's also a good way for users to kind of build that trust and get more comfortable with these platforms. Where I would say kind of the steps we need to take is just building a bit more robust checks. So you could
mm,
almost look at it as a tiered approach. So if you want just kind of the basic platform or basic profile, you just do kind of very light touch KYC. You would just do the detection to make sure that none of the photos are deepfake. If you want to have that verification badge on your profile, then you would do additional KYC checks. So I think we really need to, and again, pulling on what Irina said during the presentation was that it's that risk proportionality element. So you can have multiple tiers on how you actually want to conduct the KYC, with the most basic being, let's just cross check for any deepfakes. And then the next layer being like, okay, we'll do an email verification or we'll do a mobile phone verification. And if you do that, then you get the verification stamp. If you don't, then you won't be able to get that. And I think by introducing those tiers and those layers, you're making it harder for fraudsters to kind of go through those and to confirm
yes.
with those. And also it creates a natural point for them to stop because if they keep failing, they're just going to stop and they're going to try and do a different way.
Yeah.
So I think by introducing that, you're keeping the credibility that is tied to the verification stamp, and it's something that a lot of consumers are already they look for and they already are aware of it. They've had the education around what it means. So you're keeping that credibility. You're now just introducing additional barriers for those fraudsters so you can stop them from actually getting the verification badge.
Brilliant. For some reason, I was expecting to say a different answer to that, but I'm glad that you've kind of said that because I think that's really reassuring. And you're quite right. I think the other word you said there, of course, is education, and that's been crucial to ensure that consumers understand exactly what those verification badges actually mean, which is really important. Another quick question that's come in, and again, you may have information on this, so if you don't worry around this at all. Do you have any data on the number of bots or frauds that have a blue tick? So obviously that's in relation to X, but I mean more broadly on the variety of verification or platforms out there that have some form of verification badges. Any ideas of what the numbers might look like?
I think we have numbers. So I know we have numbers on the number of like bots that tried to get through our KYC process that we were able to identify. I know we have those numbers. I don't know if we necessarily have the numbers specific to ones that have actually successfully gone through the process and have obtained a blue tick. And I don't have the exact number at the top of my mind, but I can share with you, Simon, afterwards. Then you can share it with
Brilliant.
the association.
Brilliant. That would be really helpful. Thank you for that, Kat. And again, another great question. So we're just coming up towards the end of the hour. It's absolutely flown by, and this is a subject we can talk for lots more. I guess I want to kind of perhaps focus a little bit more on the future. And there's two questions really. So one is, what do we think the next kind of 6 months to 12 months are going to look like from a deepfake perspective? What are the things that members should start to be aware of? Where's the technology going? Where are the risks, but where are the opportunities? And the second one is from a compliance perspective, perhaps more for Arena's area there, is what are the things that platforms should be doing, at the end of this webinar, going back to their dating and social discovery platforms, the things that they should be doing now. So if I ask you those two questions, we've got about 5 minutes left. So hopefully that should be enough time to answer those two fairly open-ended questions.
Mhm. So I'll tackle the first half. I'd say I think over the next 6 months, like specifically in the UK, obviously the making, I think digital services consultation has recently closed. I think a big element of that, while not specific to online dating, one of the elements was, okay, how do we actually introduce a government-backed digital identity that is robust against things like deepfakes? So I think the conversation around deepfakes is going to continue to happen, but it's really, we're focusing more on how do we mitigate and what is the technology that we can use as the good guys to help fight the bad guys. So I think definitely keep kind of an ear out for that, just watch as it develops. And I think that conversation is happening on a global scale. So I mentioned it earlier. So we actually have a partnership with Interpol where we are doing a lot of research with them into deepfakes. And one thing that we're actually going to be doing later on this year is having another like deepfake detection challenge where we're inviting different law enforcement, we're inviting regulators to come together to say, how do we build these deepfakes and how do we mitigate them? But this time we're really aiming on giving them the actual tools that they can then take away to their local enforcement agencies to train individuals. So again, kind of hitting on that education point that we really need to start training not just regulators, not just governments, but also law enforcement agencies so they can, across multiple layers of where a consumer might fall victim to deepfake, where the harm might be, so we know how to stop mitigating these and to try and stop them from happening. I think the other thing that we're going to see in the next kind of 6 to 12 months is especially kind of like in that space of consumer protection. So I know there's a lot of conversations. We've already mentioned a couple. So in the UK, we have the Online Safety Act. There's a couple of countries that have just outright banned social media. So I think we're going to continue to see those conversations. Again, I don't think banning social media is necessarily the right path, but we are going to start to see, okay, what are the additional consumer protections we can put in place to protect both consumers under the age of 18 as well as consumers above the age of 18, so that way they're not necessarily as susceptible to harms like deepfakes or romance fraud and things like that. So again, kind of from the regulatory compliance side of things, but also again on the education side of things, like how do we make sure consumers are protected adequately? Because things like this are going to continue to happen, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So we need to have the right tools in place, both from a redress perspective as well as a technology perspective.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kat. Arena.
Well, first of all, I totally agree what Kat mentioned, but from a regulatory perspective, actually, we see that not only in dating, but across many sectors, the regulatory expectations is shifting from static compliance to kind of ongoing risk management. Because historically, like many platforms in fintech as well viewed, for instance, identity verification as a point-in-time exercise conducted during onboarding. However, currently, fraudulent attempts, including deepfakes or some kind of AI-enabled fraud, actually challenging that approach. And in fact, all the platforms are like expected to invest not only in strong onboarding controls, but for sure ongoing monitoring tools, some behavioral monitoring tools, because onboarding alone is kind of not sufficient anymore from both practical and regulatory perspectives. And of course, I think that at the same time, there should be not such as like a huge shift during the future 6 to 12 months, but all the tendencies for sure moving to identifying some suspicious behavioral patterns like coordinated fraud networks, again, some unusual messaging activity, for instance, account sharing, and something like that that is actually happening during overall user's life cycle. And I believe that ultimately the objective is not to stop the fraud entirely, because unfortunately, like nothing can realistically achieve the total stop of the fraud. However, again, the objective is to kind of demonstrate that risks are identified, understand, and assessed, and of course mitigated through like continuously evolving controls.
Brilliant. Thank you. And we've just hit 11 o'clock, so perfect timing to finish. Just once again to say a massive thank you to both Kat and Arena from Sumsub for a fantastic webinar, a fascinating topic area, and one that I'm sure we'll touch on again in the next few months as the technology evolves and develops, as well as the tools to fight back as well. So just